Okay, there we are. Welcome to seminar session number 11. We are still with the Philokalia, but we are right now reading the first century on theology. That's a shortened title for it. The full title is 200 Texts on Theology and the Incarnate Dispensation. The Incarnate Dispensation, the embodied economia of the Son of God. As I think I mentioned last time towards the end, this is a Maximus almost, well, in our reading, it seems suddenly. This is written some years later in another location, but this is more complex in a number of different ways, theologically, in terms of its thoughts, in terms of its images. We need to try to get our minds around a few of his kind of images in this section. And so what's left for something like this is to try to kind of figure a way through. There's no way that we can encompass the whole thing. So what I've tried to do is figure a way through, kind of beginning and ending with the idea of faith. There'll be more reading this time, but I'll try to make my comments as brief as possible. We just need to hear this stuff. And also some people are listening to the recordings later who don't have access to the book. So it's nice to have it read out as well, you know? All right, let me see. So let's begin. Let's begin at the beginning. The first 10 odd aphorisms, sections of the first century on theology are well known. It's kind of like a theological tour de force through, I think, it seems to me he's responding to either Aristotle or Aristotelian concerns. He's speaking of the being of God in rather Aristotle or anti-Aristotle ways. 1 to 10, but I want to focus in on 9. I want to focus in on 9. But just before that, in these first 10, Maximus moves us beyond a number of things. So he says that God is beyond the question of when and how. That's in aphorism 1. God is beyond knowledge via any natural image. That's also section 1. He is the author, curious word, author of all. That's aphorism 4. Beyond substantiveness itself, beyond essence, we might say, itself. That's 6. And even beyond the category of relationship. This is something which we really need to ponder this time. Beyond the category of relationship. That's in aphorism 7. And that is because, as he says in aphorism 6, substantive being and being which is not substantive never coincide. Essential being and being which is not essential never coincide. We might come back to that. So let's look at aphorism 9 now. I'm going to read this out, and this is where we'll begin. Same kind of idea: reading, tracing some ideas, moving through some, I hope, gathered themes. Number 9 in the first century of the 200 texts on theology and the incarnate dispensation of the Son of God. Number 9. Created beings can be known rationally via the reason, diania. This is a term we knew before. It's just a little bit below the nous, all right, the diania. He's not talking about rationalism here. But created beings can be known rationally by means of the inner principle, the logoi, which are by nature intrinsic to such beings and by which they are naturally defined. But from our apprehension of these principles inherent in created beings, we can do no more than believe that God exists. So the facts of the world don't prove God, but they gesture towards his existence. To the devout believer, God gives something more sure than any proof. The recognition, and the faith, the recognition and the faith that he substantively is. Faith is true knowledge, the principles of which are beyond rational demonstration. For faith makes real for us things beyond intellect and reason. And he gestures towards the well-known passage in the scriptures of St. Paul, who defines faith. Now, in the glossary, we referred to the glossary in this work the other day. Faith is defined nicely as a kind of a state of loving, transformative, intimate relation or relating to. Hearkening back to our conversation last time, we might say that faith is a kind of ethos of friendship. I mean, that's a down home rendition of faith, or of discipleship, right? The ethos of friendship or discipleship, maybe. The point is that our knowledge of the inner principles is augmented by our faith, which can, I think, or does, as Maximus indicates, provide us with a recognition, a knowledge or a path we didn't know lay already within us, that we might actually be partway down already. And this recognition comes up later in the images of Moses and other images in this century. So God is beyond when and how, beyond natural image, beyond substantiveness, beyond even the category of being. Yet we are given recognition and faith. These are the ways into it that he initially sets forth. Now, these are gifts. The recognition of the divine and faith are gifts. And I want to refer briefly to 4 aphorisms, 18, 20, 21, and 29, just to pull forth certain characteristics that Maximus seems to designate as part of the gift of spiritual knowledge. So 18, 20, 21, and 29. I'm just going to read selectively from these. In 18, Maximus writes at the beginning, although in his humility he has not expected it, although in his humility he has not expected it, this is the presumption that Goa likes to talk about, the opposite of recognition. Although in his humility he has not expected it, the seeker, rather, after God may suddenly receive spiritual knowledge of divine contemplation. We don't know when, we can't bring it about, so we continue our struggle. That's 18. And then 20. He who pursues spiritual knowledge for the sake of display and fails to attain it, etc., etc., etc. Cautioning against the urge for display, the urge to display one's knowledge, to put it forth. That's why Maximus writes occasional works. He doesn't write to be an author. He writes in response to things. The urge for display means the need for ascesis. And then 21. Those who truly and devoutly aspire to an understanding of created beings and have no thoughts of self-display will find that they are granted lucid insight into such beings, and through this, they attain the knowledge they seek in a most precise fashion. Now, display, self-display, this is like an odd version of what we were calling for the sake of before. If you speak for display, you're speaking for the sake of an audience, which is the cheapest kind of audience possible. You've imagined them and you're fulfilling that own thing in your mind. Without display, i.e. with the right for the sake of in mind, we come to lucidity. For the sake of cannot be a why, as we said last time. It can't be a kind of just a steady purpose, like a goal we know we will attain. It's something stranger and deeper than that. For the sake of means for the sake of what happens between and the gift that happens between. All right, and then finally, 29. Just the first here, a stark reminder of, well, for all Christians, a person who through the grace of God partakes of divine blessings is under an obligation to share them ungrudgingly with others. Under an obligation to share them ungrudgingly with others, right? Freely we have been given, right? Freely we give. This is on the level of commendation. We commend our own thoughts to others or to God with others, or it's a form of communion. It's saying this gift is not for one's own light. It's not for one's own sake. It's not even about us, really. It's a gift that then is meant to be held in common. All right. Now let's go over to 31. 31. Okay. And this really emphasizes what we can and cannot do alone, which is nothing. 31, page 120. A soul can never attain the knowledge of God unless God himself, in his condescension, takes hold of it and raises it up to himself. For the human intellect lacks the power to ascend and to participate in divine illumination, unless God himself draws it up, insofar as this is possible for the human intellect, and illumines it with rays of divine light. What is this? This is about the process, as it were, of salvation, the movements of salvation, the gathering unto communion. And it's neither unidirectional, all right? Rather, or it's not unidirectional, rather it is synergistic, a synergy together. But the synergy involves us responding to the divine, us responding to God's incarnation, or as they say here, condescension, meaning his coming down to be with us, with us, and he's descended to be with us. Right? So the incarnation, I think, is a fair equivalent of condescension. In the incarnation, God descends, he cloaks himself for us, right? This comes up later. He cloaks himself for us to be with us for our sake. There's the ultimate for the sake of. And I want to point to the phrase, unless God himself draws it up. That is the condition of spiritual progress. Draws it up, drawing, being drawn, right? Drawing or being drawn, it's like smoke in a chimney. The chimney draws, right? We can also draw something near to us. Drawing near, for a long time, it's been one of my favorite phrases. It seems to me to indicate the endless elemental movements of being human in relation to the divine, drawing near, whether we are drawn near by God or through our own efforts, we are seeking to draw near ourselves.
Andrew, you haven't spent a lot of time on a farm. I know you've spent some, but another one lovely image of drawing is the drawing of water. Perfect. And the way water is drawn.
Perfect. Drawn from the well.
Pulled forth, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's beautiful, David. Thank you. I like that. Huh. 35. Let's go on to 35. So we've begun with the first section, God is beyond all. And yet we've looked at some of the gifts of spiritual knowledge, what we've been given, and what is asked of us with this gift. And then we realize that this gift is always dependent only and not wholly, that's a little bit too much, but completely. It depends on the divine's drawing us up or drawing us near or drawing us forth, right? So 35. When what has been created in time, according to the temporal order, has reached maturity, it ceases from natural growth. When what has been created in time, that's the key term there, according to the temporal order, has reached maturity, it ceases from natural growth. But when what has been brought about by the knowledge of God through the practice of the virtues has reached maturity, it starts to grow anew. Okay. For the end of one stage constitutes the starting point of the next. He who has put an end to the root of corruption in himself by practicing the virtues is initiated into other more divine experiences. So that's the renewal of being, the natural conclusion of being, and the renewal of spiritual being. Now, there is never an end, as there is never a beginning to the good which God does. I love that. Just as the property of light is to illuminate, so the property of God is to do good. There is never an end, as there is never a beginning to the good which God does. Just as the property of light is to illuminate, so the property of God is to do good. Thus in the law, which is concerned with the structure of temporal things subject to generation and decay, the Sabbath is honored by rest from work. Whereas in the gospel, which initiates us into the realm of spiritual realities, luster is shed on the Sabbath by good actions. Okay. What I wanted to bring out was the initial thing, the natural flow of mortal, and then the ongoing movement of that which has been granted life beyond life. But these images of the law and the gospel come up later in very important ways, especially the gospel. So he says the gospel initiates us into the realm of spiritual realities. Okay, it's initiation. All right. So we have here too a sense of synergy, and more than that, a sense of appropriate pacing in the spiritual life, or partitioning. This is for this time, this is for then, this is to come, or even the sequencing of the spiritual life. I remember a priest in Toronto saying that two great dangers of the spiritual life are either trying to attain images of spiritual reality that are beyond us still, or dwelling with images of spirituality which we have matured beyond, right? In other words, staying with the present, the image that needs to speak to the present. So synergy and the appropriate pacing or sequencing of the spiritual life, because it's really in its own way too a reflection on what maturity means or what fullness means, and the relation to cessation or the relation to ongoing, let's say, spiritual progression. This is drawing near. Drawing near is without end. This is what drawing near is. It's ongoing openness. Bakhtin, the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, uses the term the open-ended present to point to the endless possibilities, the endless gifts or registers of the present. And David Goa likes to refer to the openness of presence, or the present which is an openness. This is what Maximus is getting at here in his own way. A further note, there is neither end nor beginning to God's goodness, to God's divine gifts. This is meant to quite distinctly shift our apprehension of the temporal dimension of communion, our apprehension of the temporal dimension of communion. And this idea of temporal dimensions or time, Maximus deepens this for us as we go on. All right. Now let's turn to 42, 43, and 45. And here we meet one of these images that I spoke about at the beginning. One of Maximus' one of his conceptual images, one of his deep images, or series of images, more precisely. So 42, 43, and 45. And this is about harvest, the harvest of harvest, and the harvest of God. He also uses circumcision, the circumcision of circumcision, and so on, and 6th, 7th, and 8th days. We return to the days. Here, just the harvest. 42. Harvest signifies the deiform soul, the soul with intelligence, the deiform soul's ingathering and knowledge of the more spiritual principles of created beings in a manner conforming to both virtue and nature. Virtue and nature. Now, this is the harvest of spiritual effort, the gathering into fullness, in which virtue and nature are not distinguished sharply, which is interesting. 43. Harvest of harvest, so that was harvest. Now, harvest of harvest signifies the apprehension of God, which follows the mystical contemplation of noetic realities, and which, inaccessible to all, is consummated in the intellect in a manner beyond understanding. The apprehension of God, which follows the mystical contemplation of noetic realities, the theoria of noetic realities, and which, inaccessible to all, is consummated in the intellect in a manner beyond understanding. Such apprehension is fittingly reaped by the person who in a worthy manner honors the Creator because of what he has created, whether visible or invisible, whether visible or invisible. this is the translation of noetic insight into the aesthetic world. But even more than that, I think the harvest of harvest signals the ease of apprehension granted by God, the joy of knowing granted by God, right? We talk a lot about our own efforts, but the gifts of God surpass all of this. It's not our doing which brings about a harvest of harvest, but it is our for the sake of which leads us into that spiritual condition given by the Trinity. Okay, and then over to 45. The harvest of God is on the next page, just down slightly. The harvest of God, so we had harvest, we've had harvest of harvest. Now the harvest of God signifies the total dwelling and stability of the saints in God at the consummation of the ages. That's the second time we've seen consummation, very, very in short order. Interesting. The harvest of God signifies rather the total dwelling and stability of the saints in God at the consummation of the ages. Time is not overcome or rejected or discarded. It is consummated. So I don't think, well, the only thing that I think to be said here about that now is that it seems to indicate the communion of saints beyond time. I don't know anything else beyond that. Is much more there, but not for me now. So maybe for us later. Harvest, harvest of harvest, and the harvest of God. Now, in a way, this is not even really about time, right? But rather, it's about or of being or spirits. It's the temporal aspects of the images, the gathering, at the end of the season. Fair enough. Maximus is deepening or developing this image which is provisional. Provisional means provided for the moment. It provides the moment with its richness. It's also appropriate. It emerges from what he's trying to say. But it's not a final vision. None of his images are final, as in to be set up as an idol, to be taken as the true image. So he's deepening or developing this image of harvest to plumb or sound the scope of our comprehension of spiritual fruits. That's what I think it is. I think he's distinguishing these so that we reconsider what we think it means to aim for or understand or comprehend or encounter spiritual fruits, right? In other words, he's asking in his own way, what is the meaning or the sense of the idea or even the term spiritual progression? Why do we use that term, and why is it so wrapped up with time? That's a question just to hold in our minds. Now we're moving on to 48, 49, and 50. We're getting into the deeper ones. 48 and 49 and 50. I'm going to read these, all three of them, just so that we hear them. Okay. I only have a few things to say about 49 and 50, but the care with which Maximus distinguishes how we can think about, or how we ought not to think about, the category of relation in connection with God. Remember at the beginning in 6 or 7, I think, God is beyond the category of relationship. Here is where he makes his case for that, and it's an amazing case. 48, this is lower half of 123, page 123. I don't think we have to get too tangled up in this language, but I think we need to undergo it. One should learn from those imbued with spiritual knowledge what is to be understood by the works which God began to do, and what by those which he did not begin to do. Okay, so one should learn of our elders what is to be understood, not learn to understand, but learn what is to be understood by the works which God began to do, and what by those which he did not begin to do. For if he rested from all the works which he began to do, clearly he did not rest from those works which he did not begin to do. Perhaps then, all that participates in being, here's the first category, all that participates in being, such as the various essences of creatures, are works of God which began to be in time. Okay, so participant beings are of time. For they have non-being as prior to their own being, since participant beings have not always existed. We speak in this term liturgically. Our life is in Christ, is of God. Our life in Christ. We have no life. That's what we are, participating beings, right? Participle beings, following on, in which participant beings participate by grace, so the beings in which one participates, such as goodness and all that is included in the principle of goodness, are perhaps, look how cautious he is, perhaps works of God which did not begin to be in time. So participle beings are perhaps works of God which did not begin to be in time. Briefly, these include all life, immortality, simplicity, there you go, immutability, and infinity, and all other qualities. Look how widely he opens it. All other qualities that contemplative vision perceives as substantively appertaining to God. He's not speaking apophatically here because there is nothing which substantively appertains to God. But he's speaking in a kind of in a positive, in a cataphatic manner, which is appropriate. These are works of God, yet not begun in time. Okay, these are works of God, yet not begun in time. And remember, our focus is what is to be understood by the works begun in time and not begun in time. For non-being is never prior to goodness. Yeah, that's good, huh? Nor to any of the other things we have listed, even if those things which participate in them do in themselves have a beginning in time. Okay. All goodness is without beginning because there is no time prior to it. God is eternally the unique author of its being. Hearkening back to the earlier passage, there is neither end nor beginning to the goodness God does. And this image of the author of being reappears. So creation, time, and rest, participle beings seem to be beyond time, or at least without time. I think without time is safer, maybe not beyond time, but without time. And participants, beings, us, more creatures, and much of the natural world, are within time. Okay, so that's beginning to try to clarify the works of God and time. Look at 49 now. God is infinitely above all beings, whether participant or participable, pardon me. For whatever belongs to the category of being is a work of God. Okay, anytime we say is, we're talking about something God created. For whatever belongs to the category of being is a work of God, even though participant beings had a temporal origin, whereas participable beings were implanted by grace among things that come into existence in time. In this way, participable, right, things like life, immortality, simplicity, infinity, and so on, are a kind of innate power, dynamis, clearly proclaiming God's presence, God's parousia, in all things. So what do we have now? God is infinitely above all beings. These two categories of participable and participant are clearly only for us. Now, 50. All immortal things and immortality itself, all living things and life itself, all holy things and holiness itself, all good things and goodness itself, all blessings and blessedness itself, all beings and being itself. Isn't that lovely the way he puts that? All beings and being itself are manifestly works of God. Some things began to be in time, for they have not always existed. Others did not begin to be in time. Pardon me. For goodness, blessedness, holiness, and immortality have always existed. Created, but have always existed beyond, see, without time or beyond, it's hard to tell. Those things which began in time exist and are said to exist. I love that. That's is and are phrased to exist by participation in the things which did not begin in time, right? Think back to our conversation of the eternal being, and that beautiful way that David connected being and eternal being before. Maximus is returning to this, but with more complex vision. Those things which began in time exist and are said to exist by participation in the things which did not begin in time. For God is the creator of all life. Here's within and without time. All life, immortality, holiness, and goodness. He transcends the being of all intelligible and describable beings. Now, what is this? What's he saying here? The only thing that I have in my notes is this wondrous sentence. Those things which began in time exist and are said to exist by participation in the things which did not begin in time. Our life, our breath is dependent on our participation in the divine. But this also, it strikes one that this also indicates the radical error or mistakenness of trying to think of telos or eschatology or any of these great Christian themes in terms of time, right? As if they're temporal things. Remember, the temporal dimension of communion, that's part of what we're thinking about today. Those things which began in time exist through participation in the things which did not begin in time, and God created both, and we're of the former order. All right, now more on time, and forgive me, it's a little bit jumping around, but I want to look at, in this order, 51, and then 55, and then 56, and then 54. 51, 55, 56, and then 54. And I'm going to read, but then it's mainly to gloss what I think are the kind of theme that we draw forth from it. 51. Here Maximus sets out all three of his day images. All right. The sixth day of creation, according to Scripture, represents the completion of the beings that are subject to nature. The seventh day marks the limits of the flow of temporal existence. I think of the harvest of harvest, and harvest of God too. The eighth day betokens the quality of that state which is beyond nature and time. Okay. The sixth day of creation represents the completion of the beings which are subject to nature. The seventh day marks the limit of the flow of temporal existence. The eighth day betokens the quality of that state which is beyond nature and time. Okay, so the sixth day, just one second. Oh, no, this is all three kinds of days related to nature and time in terms of nature and time. Okay, the sixth day, the seventh day, and the eighth day in terms of nature and time. Now, on over to 55, and he again relates these days, but in terms of fullness and fulfillment. So not time anymore, but fullness and fulfillment. 55. The sixth day is the complete fulfillment on the part of those practicing the ascetic life of the natural activities which lead to virtue. The seventh is the conclusion and cessation in those leading the contemplative life of all natural thoughts about inexpressible spiritual knowledge, right? Not temporal, but activity, energy. The eighth day is the transposition and transmutation of those found worthy into a state of deification, all right? Okay, about time again. The Lord giving perhaps a mysterious hint of the seventh and the eighth days, spoke of a day and an hour of consummation, which encompasses the mysteries and the inner essences of all things. That's an absolutely astonishing statement. A day and an hour of consummation, which encompasses the mysteries and the inner essences of all things. Apart from their creator, the blessed divinity himself, there is no power whatsoever in heaven or on earth that can know that day or hour before the actual experience of them. Again, this is not temporal. It can't be. not in this way, not in this frame, not in the terms that he's just left behind. Okay, and then 56. And 56 here, we return to a very familiar three-part image, which is days are related to the mystery of given modes of being, well-being, and eternal well-being. So 56. The sixth day betokens the inner essence of the being of created things. The seventh signifies the quality of the well-being of created things. The eighth denotes the inexpressible mystery of the eternal well-being of created things. Still with created things, but figured in terms of being, well-being, and eternal well-being. And we know that these are not temporal categories anymore. Just as David said one or two times ago, the eternal is not is beyond and in fact gives birth to time. It's not defined by time. Same here. These terms are beyond and giving birth to or related to time, but not defined by time. And 54, finally. 54, and this is also amazing. He who, after the example of God, has completed the sixth day with fitting actions and thoughts, appropriate actions and thoughts, appropriate activity, and has himself, with God's help, brought his own actions to a successful conclusion, has in his understanding traversed the condition of all things subject to nature and time, and has entered into the mystical contemplation of the eons and the things inherent in them. Okay. His Sabbath is his intellect's utter and incomprehensible abandonment and transcendence. Both. Abandon is leave taking, not disdain. Abandonment and transcendence of created beings. Okay, that's the sixth day, an astonishing claim. And then he rather goes straight to the eighth day, oddly. But if he is also found worthy of the eighth day, he has risen from the dead, that is, from all that is sequent to God, whether sensible or intelligible, expressible or conceivable. He experiences the blessed life of God, who is the only true life, and himself becomes God by deification. Risen from the dead, risen from every dead thing that we put in front of us or that we think is in front of us as we try to draw near, or properly, we are being drawn near to God. Resurrection is not temporal in the sense like I die today and I awake tomorrow. It's something else is going on there. I think he's saying here. So what is this about? This is about discernment and apprehension, and then images of resurrection and theosis. Risen from the dead, that is, from all that is sequent to God, that's presence. That's presence. And with the for the sake of the divine, then we have a fuller image of spiritual well-being. Risen from the dead, presence. The point of, and 66 now, let's go to 66. The point of Christ's condescension, Christ coming down to be with us, Christ rendering himself lower in order to be with us, is always, pardon me, presence and resurrection. So that's what I want to look at here. 66. The mystery of the incarnation of the Logos is the key to all the arcane symbolism and typology in the scriptures, and in addition gives us knowledge of created things, both visible and intelligible. Michael, you're focused on the incarnation, which is so beautiful. You've pinpointed it. The incarnation is the clue, the center of creation. He who apprehends the mystery of the cross and the burial apprehends the inward essences of created beings, while he who is initiated into the inexpressible power of the resurrection, right, risen from all that is sequent to God, apprehends the purpose for which God first established everything, apprehends the purpose for which God first establish everything. Now, I have a few thoughts here. Mystery, first of all, in this sense, mystery means a kind of unsoundable and unplumbable spiritual reality, and yet one constantly apprehended in part. Excuse me. It doesn't mean an enigma. It doesn't mean something to be solved. It means something which is unfathomable. Incarnation here means the integration of the divine and human. So he's talking about Christ, but he's also talking about us, what Christ gives us through. And the incarnation of the Logos, I don't know about or the Logos, but what strikes me here is that maybe this term Logos indicates the orientation proper to our gift of life, the kind of directedness of our spirit having been given the gift of life. That's I can't say more about that, which would make sense about that term Logos here. But with the images of the cross and burial, these are images of our life, of creation, of our mortal life, right? The cross and burial. Resurrection, again, the resurrection is what grants us the presence of God. So it is of God. And in this resurrection, we gain our sense of the purpose for which, all right? That sounds dangerously close to kind of a why God, why God created, which we have to be very, very careful of. But purpose for which is not why. It's kind of the thing-like version of for the sake of. For the sake of, purpose for which has an object. It's not an explanation. It's not an idea. And because the center is the mystery of the incarnation is the integration of human and divine, what we're talking about here is intimacy with God and with each other. That's the purpose for which God created, first established everything. Intimacy with God and with each other. All right, just a couple more minutes. Follow this through. The gospel is what gives us the story of Christ, the images of Christ. Let's turn to 90 and 93 here for a minute. 90 and 93. And I'm not so interested here, it might be important, but I'm not so interested in his distinction between the law and the gospel. I'm interested in what he says about the gospel. That place, that topos of resurrection from the dead, of presence with God and with each other. All right. 90. The law is the shadow of the gospel. The gospel is the image of the blessings held in store. The law checks the actualization of evil. The gospel brings about the realization of divine blessings. Okay, so in this one, the gospel is the image of the blessings held in store, image of something held in store, and also brings about the realization of divine blessings. We've encountered this before, where Maximus's use of the word image is not as sometimes for the modern mind or ear. He doesn't mean representation of. It's more figuring or presentation of. So the image of the blessings held in store, and yet in the same section, he bring about the realization blessings. So either there are different kinds of blessings, or blessing is not exhausted by one act, and we shouldn't think of it being one time or a momentary thing. I don't know. But image and realization here are held together. That's one thing. Image and realization are held together. And that's interesting, I think. And then 93. The law is a shadow, and the prophets are an image of the divine and spiritual blessings contained in the gospel. Okay. The truth itself, foreshadowed in the law and prefigured in the prophets, is revealed in the gospel as now present to us through actual events. Now present to us through actual events. So here we have, pertaining to the gospel, the truth itself is revealed in the gospel as now present to us through actual events. through through our historical being. So we have the gospel is the image and the realization and the truth itself being revealed, right? These are all circling around, I think, concepts of aletheia, of presence, of events, or of encounters even from last time. So the gospel is not to be understood by us as having a static being. It's living, it's alive. And so when these different terms are applied to it, they're all true, because it's all in ferment there, it's all roiling there. But it depends in part on how we see things, right? And in particular, how we encounter the main meaning, the center of the gospel, which is the God-man Jesus Christ. So Maximus helps us out here. Go to pardon me, 97. Yeah, 97. All right. To the more diligent students of Holy Scripture, that's just an intro, a way in. The Lord is clearly shown as having two forms. The first is common and more popular, and it can be perceived by many. Well, we all see. The text, "We saw him and he had no comeliness or beauty," from Isaiah, refers to this form. The second is more hidden, and it can be perceived only by a few, that is, by those who have already become like the holy apostles Peter and John, before whom the Lord was transfigured with a glory that overwhelmed the senses. The text, "Thou art fairer than the children of men," refers to this form. The first of these two forms is consonant to beginners. The second to those perfected in spiritual knowledge, insofar, he always adds this caveat, insofar as such perfection is possible. Remember the priest in Toronto, the dangers in the spiritual life are thinking we should be further along than we are, or thinking we're not as far along as we are. That's what he's talking about. Beginners and those who have a more perfect knowledge. The first is an image of the Lord's initial advent, to which the literal meaning of the gospel refers, and which by means of suffering purifies those practicing the virtues. The second prefigures the second and glorious advent, in which the spirit of the gospel is apprehended, and by means of wisdom, transfigures and deifies those imbued with spiritual knowledge, because of the transfiguration of the Logos within them. All right. Because of that, they reflect with unveiled face the glory of the Lord. Two forms of Christ. We know that there is one figure of Christ, one Christ. So he's not talking about distinct realities. It's about, he's measuring our own apperception in encounter. He's saying, if we see this when we look at Christ, this is involved. This. The first, historical, right? The man Jesus whom many people met, which is on the level of aesthetic rather, and related to the phenomenal register. That's Christ too, the aesthetic, phenomenal, historical register. Christ is there too. He's not abstracted. But the other essential or noetic register related to the spiritual. That's the kind of vision which is also the gift, having worked through the initial. And then he says here, Christ's transfiguration prefigures his second advent, right? Prefigures his second advent, which draws near, or pulls forward each person's own inward transfiguration of the Logos, the term from before, the inward transfiguration of the Logos, which is part of us, right? Because of the transfiguration of the Logos within them, they reflect the unveiled face of the glory of God. So this is not only not simply or categorically defined temporally, it's also not really simply or categorically defined in terms of being. Now, there's another major page in a bit that we need to read. David Goa, do you feel up for a little bit of reading? I've spoken for a long time. Would you mind reading a few of these out for us?
Which ones?
After I give a little 81, 82, 83, 84, and 85. The movement of the mind, and then the images of Moses, 81 to 85. Just briefly before we get there. In this, Maximus seems to gesture, these are the most stunning passages, I think, in his work, maybe, or very close to it. He gestures towards a silence beyond thinking. All right, these are the themes I have in mind. We can listen when David's reading them. The silence beyond thinking, or as he says, beyond intellection. And then in 82, the relationship of God and being, or the simple ethos of God, the simplicity of God beyond being and beyond intellection, as Maximus says, i.e. not composite, as we saw last time. And then in 83, Maximus points towards the theoria of God, the apophatic stance, the apophatic rootedness, which is able to apprehend or be apprehended by God. And then in 84 and 85, Maximus has this really beautiful little meditation on the figure of Moses. And he ends with an absolutely remarkable sense that Moses has inscribed within himself an icon of faith. That's where we're gonna come to. But pardon me, David, do you feel up to it? Would you mind reading this? You have such a lovely way of reading too.
Sure.
81 to 84.
Until our minds in purity have transcended our own being and that of all things sequenced to God, we have not yet acquired a permanent state of holiness. When this noble state has, by means of love, been established in us, we shall know the power of the divine promise. For we must believe that which the intellect, taking the lead, has by means of love rooted its power. There the saints will find a changeless abode. He who has not transcended himself and all that is in any way subject to intellection, and has not come to abide in the silence beyond intellection, cannot be entirely free from change. Every intellection has either a multiple or at least a dual aspect. For it is an intermediary relationship between two extremes, an intellective being and an intelligible being, and links the one to the other. Hence, neither extreme can possess an absolute simplicity. An intellective being is a subject, and so the capacity of apprehending some intelligible object is necessarily associated with it. And an intelligible being necessarily either is a subject or exists in a subject. As a subject it possesses the intrinsic capacity of being apprehended by an intellective being. As existing in a subject, it presupposes a being in which it exists potentially. For no creature is in itself a simple being or intellection in such a way as to constitute an indivisible unity. Thus, if we call God a being, then the capacity to be apprehended by a process of intellection is not inherent in his nature. For if it were, he would be composite. Or if we call him an intellection, then he does not possess an essence with a natural capacity for being an intellective subject, but he himself is intellection in his very essence. The whole of God is intellection and intellection alone. But in terms of intellection, he is also being. The whole of God is being and being alone. And yet the whole of God is beyond being and beyond intellection because he is an indivisible unity, simple and without parts. Thus, whoever, to whatever degree, still apprehends by means of intellection has not yet transcended duality. But he who has advanced together beyond intellection has renounced it because he has transcended it, has come to dwell to some extent in unity. In the multiplicity of beings, there is diversity, dissimilarity, and difference. But in God, who is in an absolute sense one and alone, there is only identity, simplicity, and similarity. It is therefore not safe to devote oneself to the contemplation of God before one has advanced beyond the multiplicity of beings. Moses shows this when he pitched the tent of his mind outside the camp and then conversed with God. For it is dangerous to attempt to utter the inexpressible by means of the spoken word, for the spoken word involves duality or more than duality. The surest way is to contemplate pure being silently in the soul alone, because pure being is established in undivided unity and not among the multiplicity of things. The high priest, who was commanded to go into the Holy of Holies within the veil only once every year, shows us that only he who has passed through what is immaterial and holy and has entered the Holy of Holies, that is, who has transcended the whole natural world of sensible and intelligible realities, is free from all that is specific to creatures and whose mind is unclad and naked, is able to attain the vision of God. When Moses pitches his tent outside the camp, that is, when he establishes his will and mind outside the world of visible things, he begins to worship God. Then, entering into the darkness, that is, into the formless and immaterial realm of spiritual knowledge, he there celebrates the most sacred rites. The darkness is that formless, immaterial, and bodiless state which embodies the knowledge of the prototypes of all created things. He who, like another Moses, enters into it, although mortal by nature, understands things that are immortal. Through his knowledge, he depicts in himself the beauty of divine excellence, as if painting a picture which is a faithful copy of archetypal beauty. Then he comes down from the mountain and offers himself as an example to those who wish to imitate that excellence. In this way, he manifests the love and generosity of the grace he has received.
That's beautiful. Thank you, David. Excellence in that second last sentence. That's virtue, no? What we translate, that's arete.
Yeah.
Almost certainly. David, do you want to? I mean, you're in full breath, and you've just read that so beautifully. Do you want to head back in, maybe via the end? What I'm interested in asking or pursuing here. I wonder about the phrase, the prototypes of all created things. That seems curious. I mean, that might be a translation of the logoi. It might be a different, but prototype, those are both Greek words. But this idea of, through this knowledge, he depicts in himself the beauty of divine excellence, as if painting a picture, etc. That's such a curious turn of phrase. He depicts within himself. What is this holy image that is drawn forth from divine darkness? What does that mean? Through this knowledge, he depicts in himself. It's not saying through this experience. I mean, but he is it a renewal? Is it a renewal? And so it's such a striking event that it becomes as if something deliberately inscribed within.
David scratching his chin. What do you think, David?
I like the use of the word author before, in attributing it to God, that God's beyond being the author. And here he's talking about the artist, painting in yourself that which reflects the beauty of what is. And I can't help but think that it's partly that act itself that is revelatory. It's not just the faithfulness of the drawing. It's the posture of artist and author that reveals something that for most of us we just live with as object and not subject. We live as that is painted, or that we are the image of, rather than this concept of it. I don't know. It's a beautiful language. I'm not doing it. Fortunately, Maximus also says you can't really articulate this stuff, so I'm proving his point.
One of the things that has struck me for years is, and I mean, I don't know anything about this at all, but I get struck often by things I don't know anything about. I've said on occasion that it seems to me the difference between first-rate artistic works and second-rate one, and remember E. Cummings' comment, the difference between first-rate and second-rate is enormous compared to the difference between second-rate and 10th-rate.
Yeah.
That the difference between them, in my very limited sense, it seems to me when I stand in the presence of what seems to me to be just a work of excellence, it has a presence which is simply not there in second-rate or anything else. I mean, they may be good, they may be technically beautiful and what have you, but the presence isn't there. And I don't know, but it's often occurred to me that the painter or the sculptor, the reason the work maybe to use some of his language, the reason the work is archetypal is that what we see is what has already happened within the mind and the heart of the artist. That transfiguration has occurred within them, and they are somehow or other given the gift to follow Maximus's little analogy here, to paint it. So Moses, I mean, let's remember the narrative. I mean, he goes up the mountain. He goes into the darkness. Moses is according to Islam, is the only prophet that talks to God. The others listen, but he's the only one that talks to God. So he has a very special place. He has this conversation, and that of course begins when he's still a young man. I mean, David invited me to the Getty some years ago when they had their extraordinary exhibition of the icons of Mount Sinai, which was there for a period of time. And I remember, David, and you must too, how striking it was to see the icon of the young Moses.
Yeah.
You don't know whether he was taking his shoes off or whether he was finally putting them back on. But it's that gesture with the burning bush, the bush that burns and is not consumed. And with a slightly wild look in his eye. You know, the conversation begins then. And then he goes up Sinai. And of course, both of those are initiations. Both of them are transformative. And while he is there, what happens? So this is Maximus's sense about him coming down and manifesting that divine excellence. He is something made new. He comes down and the people have gotten impatient. and they have decided that the gods of the flesh are at least going to give them some creature comfort. So they take all of their jewelry, and it's interesting that the Levites in some ways are the ones that put them up to this. The priestly class, there's a lesson in that for us. And part of the priestly class, the Cohens, well, they participate in putting them up to this. That is, well, we can be charitable about it, to try and keep their attention and to not have them just run off into the desert. They focus them on the world of the senses, the world of fecundity, the world of reproduction. And in the Jewish tradition, it says that, well, the Cohens were involved in orchestrating this while Moses was up the mountains. They did not bow down to the golden calf, which is why to this day, in synagogue services where the Torah is taken out, the first person to get an aliyah, that is the first one to read from the Torah, is a Cohen, in memory of the fact that, yes, there was a huge misstep there, but they didn't bow down. So they get the first crack at the Torah. I also think there's something in this, and I think Maximus makes a great deal of it in such a short way here. The entrance into the darkness. And in a sense, it's the fear of the darkness that means you the fear of the darkness, the fear of the immaterial, the fear of the bodiless state, the fear of that which leads us to erect things in its place, to erect idols, to erect that which gives us at least some orientation in life.
As if it's a lack.
It's a lack, yeah. Yeah. And so, so he goes on there to say that he who like another Moses enters into it, although mortal by nature, understands things that are immortal. So we need to remember again what that word means, you know. It has death at its center, morte. So we are immortal by nature, but we don't have to see life through the prism of death. Death doesn't have to be the way in which our vision is oriented to life. Which seems to me to be kind of the meta-narrative of the whole of Scripture. So he comes down from the mountain and offers himself and his example to those who wish to imitate that excellence. In this way, he manifests the love and generosity of the grace he has received. Anyone who comes down from the mountain, anyone who comes out of the darkness, does so because of the grace they've received. made it possible for them to no longer be captured by the fear of death, by morte. It's also so interesting to me, this reflection of his about Moses pitching his tent outside the camp. You know, it's interesting, isn't it, that here is the one who's leading them, the one who's got that unbelievable burden. And in some ways, his will and mind I mean, this must always be the way it is with leadership, where your will and mind are in some ways captive of what that role is, captive of the visible things, the obvious. And Moses was, you know, struggled with that all the time. And in some of the Jewish rabbis say that that is why he couldn't enter the promised land. It wasn't that he had killed an Egyptian, although that wasn't ideal, but it was that he struck the rock, when in fact he was promised that what was sufficient would be supplied. So you have to sometimes go outside the camp. To have your will. It's interesting, huh? It's his will and his mind no longer anchored in the expedient, in the obvious, in what is necessary, in what is expected, in what is normal. And only then does worship begin. And only then is one able to enter into the darkness. Yeah. It's just, where does he come from, Maximus? I mean, I just think it is unbelievable.
David, and in case we get caught up at marveling at the mastery of this mind, may I rejoin with two things that I think are from what you said and maybe will lead to something else. Moses striking the rock, that act of almost arrogation, taking something which he said he would be given, trying to take it inappropriately, or to produce or reproduce something instead of letting it just be. That reproduction, which I think you really beautifully laid out, that then is what Maximus means by the world of multiplicity, no?
Mm-hmm.
Over in the immediately preceding passages.
Mm-hmm.
If one is still caught up in the world of multiplicity, then one is not directed appropriately towards the simplicity of God. As reproduction. And then going back to Jennings, I love what you said about the artist, and then Goa, you followed up with your own beautiful thoughts. If the artist doesn't reproduce something, okay. we can speak about manifesting an inward feeling or image or figure, what have you. We can talk about producing it or reproducing it from without, from within. But, and now, pardon me, I forget David Jennings, David Goa. I'm going to mix you two perhaps here. The idea that the work itself is but a depiction, but an again of what the artist holds in mind. Is this not a process of recognition? A kind of recognition not only of the beauty in one, it's a recognition through articulating it, formally, and recognition, because Maximus in the beginning, remember we said he gives us recognition and faith, and so I've had recognition. It's in Aphorism 9. We read it first, right? It gives us recognition and faith. So if this movement the two Davids are talking about, this movement, the artistic movement, it's a recognition of the beauty, the beautiful thing in one, right? It's also a recognition of its genesis, of its divine origin, Genesis, because of course, but also it's a form of recognition of its kind of scope and compass, where it ought to be, which is in the world. So at least what I heard, or perhaps I don't mean to misquote you or something like that, but that beautiful process you each spoke about, the artistic process, perhaps it's a series of recognitions, a recognition that something is beautiful in one, a recognition that it is from the divine, and a recognition that it is to be held in common. It's a side step and a little song and dance over there. I don't know if it means anything, but that's what I heard and I think that's very, very beautiful.
Can I just add to it, given something
No, I'm
you
done.
said?
No, please, go on.
Something you said about, talking about the smoke, or David, the water, and how it's drawn. Art, when someone is drawing in art, you're trying to draw. You're bringing in that same element of the beauty. You are trying to draw it towards
draw near. Yeah.
To draw near.
Yeah.
There was a great artist I knew, great musician, been in symphonies, etc., but chose a different career path. And I asked why, and he said, because I had the talent, I didn't have the gift. And I think that's what gets to David's point about E. Cummings, the chasm between the first and second rate. Did I have the gift? And it is this giftedness that Maximus writes about elsewhere in our reading today, of its, because of giftedness, it develops a humility. The giftedness is not that we own it, or that it comes from us, but rather from God. And I think it's that reveals that most excellent beauty, because Moses comes at it with, as the artist comes to his life, drawing forth that which he knows is pure gift, and then can emulate that for others.
I really like that, Jennings. I think that's perfect. And I think it harkens back to something that 2-3 sessions ago, Goa, when you were focusing on this word to give, the giver of life, the gift, the gift. And we mused if giving in this heightened sense might not be akin somehow to creating, right? So in the act of when we think of human creation, really, I like how you just put it, Jennings. I don't want to recast it. It's too nice, but it's the gift, the givingness.
And part of what it really speaks to is at least, again, here's something that I don't really know, but I suspect is the case, that most artists, of this first level, they don't know that it's theirs. They don't think of it that way. I remember a lovely little passage in Elizabeth Mann Borges, Thomas Mann's daughter, where she talks about as a little child crawling up on his lap. And he would take a book off the shelf and start reading to her. And she said he would read for a little while and then he'd laugh. And she said it was a very particular laugh. And she said, I didn't realize till I was older what those moments were. Those moments were, he had taken a book off the shelf that he had written. And he was reading to her from it. And then he laughed. And the laugh was, really? I had something to do with this? You know? So, I mean, that's the humility part of this, that it doesn't happen. It isn't given unless there's emptiness. Unless you're not in the way. Unless your will and your mind has taken the back seat.
I'm not sure if now is the moment to switch tack slightly. It might not be. So we may or may not, but I'm wondering, particularly Michael and Lorraine and Goa and Jennings, these immense images of days in the middle that we read in the 50s, 51, 52. It's kind of, we read out 51, 55, 56, and 54. And we looked at, we thought briefly, are days, the term days, is it related to nature and time, or perhaps to fullness and fulfillment, or perhaps to the mystery of given modes of being, well-being, eternal well-being. And then he translates this even further into a very interesting kind of meditation on resurrection and temporal modes and the kind of the implications of the very strong phrase "risen from the dead," and so on and so forth. This stuff is so immense that that it's hard to say much, as we're clearly seeing. But for any of you, further thoughts in this area? Did this passage, it must have struck you because it's amazing, but was it a striking and a deepening, or a striking and a shattering? What emerges from these here? What do we see here? Wide open, no one on the spot, wide open.
Which aphorisms were you referring to?
Pardon me. So specifically, it would be from 51 to 60. It's within these 10 aphorisms that he lays forth the symbolism of the days. It's not his symbol. It's it's an ancient symbol, and then the idea of a 6th, 7th, and 8th day is biblical. So it's as far back as we go, but he has his own particular way of phrasing it, of seeing it. We saw it in 3 or 4 different ways.
In a sense, I think it, if I may.
Please go ahead. Please.
I think it's before that as well. It's what he does with harvest, what he does with circumcision,
right,
and what he does with days. And this is so central to his thought. It follows, or at least I'll suggest that it follows his way of thinking about our nature. What is our nature and our capacity for virtue, and then what is the capacity, as he says, in the harvest of harvest, or the seventh day, or the circumcision of circumcision, that also through a kind of ascesis, kind of discipline, we can begin to apprehend. We can begin to contemplate. We can begin to realize that our nature and our virtue, as significant as they are, that there is more than that too. There's more than that too. And I love the fact that he uses the word consummation. He uses it, I think, in all of these three images. In part, I guess I love that use, and I'd never thought of it before, because consummation is being drawn out of yourself. It has a dimension of givenness to it, and a dimension of that's beyond your control. So just with the harvest as virtue, the harvest of harvest as ascesis, he's working with, how does this work in the spiritual life? And then the harvest of God, theosis, that in fact ascesis isn't its own servant. It's meant to open you to that which is seeking to draw so nearer to you than your own breath. So it occurred to me as you were going through them, that the three kinds of harvest, the circumcision ones, and then the days, were all in service to this way he has of speaking about. And it's not really right to call it the spiritual journey, because that means that we're somehow doing it.
Or progression, or
yeah, it's not a progression. It's about being disposed in a new way.
a steadfastness, a kind of directness.
Yeah, or forms of communion, because there is a communion in one's own nature when one is virtuous. I don't know anything about it, but I think I talked to David Jennings once, and he told me about it. There is a kind of communion in the harvest of harvest, in the opening up to the contemplation.
Yeah,
those moments where one is seized by the holy. And then, of course, that which we don't have any words for, theosis, where the consummation of the ages, the total indwelling.
And David, I like your focus on this. Just to follow you, I like your focus on consummation. It strikes me that consummation can sometimes seem to mean, and this harkens back to your querying and rejection of terms like progression or journey. But consummation can seem to mean the kind of highest instance of something that then also culminates. It kind of can be mistaken for culmination or blended with. So it and then that's it, right?
Yeah, it's odd. It's consumed as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and there you go, and consumed.
Yeah.
But then I thought, and to use this kind of phraseology or phrasing, pardon me, not phrasing, from when have you, historically. To consummate a marriage is to make love for the first time, right? It's a kind of strange, maybe interesting symbol of unity or intimacy. But that consummation is by no means the end of something or the diminishment. It's the opening up of something. It's this is now part of how you will know each other forever. And it is an extraordinarily deep form of knowledge, and it is also, the biblical and these Orthodox, and more across the Christian, but Orthodox especially, language of erotic intimacy. Yeah, I think you're right to land on that word. That's really good.
So culmination and consumed. I mean, not consumed in the sense of wiped out, but in the sense of that which is not in your control. The communion that is given.
Yeah, I like that what you said earlier too. Beyond us, it is a gift. It's not an activity of ours.
But back to the days.
Please.
Sorry.
No, cool. Days here stand in for aeons, right? More or less, biblically speaking. An aeon is what? Measured how? By an event? By a change? It's not measured in terms of clocked. Just like age isn't measured in terms of, a century is a definite time period. Age or aeon or era even. These are distinction. These are distinct. Now we've got to be careful again, hearkening to what you just said, Goa, about images of progression or something. Steps maybe, or movements of deepening or of indwelling in the spiritual life.
I think I prefer movements to steps. We have John Climacus's Ladder of Divine Ascent. And while it has its usefulness, it also suggests something that I've never been very comfortable in, but that's probably because I don't understand it. It seems too regimented for my life anyways. I've long thought of the movement in the spiritual life as being at best a spiral where things come around again. Our struggles come around again. Our joys may come around again. All we can hope and pray for is that every time they come around, we have moved a little bit, and that the insight that comes will be a further form of purification of our passions, a little more illumination, a drawing nearer, more freedom. But my sense is that they don't occur in lockstep. People aren't purified, illuminated, deified, as if this is a recipe. Well, if it is, it's a recipe in a book that I don't know how to read.
Oh,
David,
David, that's that whole iterative process.
Hmm.
I mean, to draw from a different tradition, the letters of Charles or John Wesley always ended the chiefest of all sinners. And we see this with all of the saints. They felt sin more deeply and felt they were so far, but it was their saintliness that made them more alive to their sinfulness.
Yeah.
That is that iterative process of what you're talking about. And
Yeah.
it isn't a mechanical,
Yeah.
once that steps happen, then you don't go back. If it's a perichoretic dance, you're always stepping backwards as well.
Sure. Yeah.
David Jennings, while in tune with what you just said, I always wonder when someone designates themselves in such an extreme position on either side. I wonder what's going on. But Goa, I want to ask and Jennings and Lorraine and Michael, wide open, but David, go because you've just been musing on this. It is true that an image, a spiritual image such as a ladder, and I'm talking about a figure, not image in the sense of the gospel as image and realization, and I'm talking about a figure, spiritual figure of the ladder. It is nearly off-puttingly clunky in a sense. So when the monk John writes that, does he know, is he writing for an audience which will so easily see past the temptation to take that literally that he doesn't worry about it? And the reason I ask that question is because here in this first century on theology, Maximus all of a sudden gives us three very strong images and tripled images. I mean, they're strong. We've been thinking in terms of his images for some time now, right? We don't find the same thing in his earlier works. We don't find such sustained, strong image. So now I'm talking about the articulation of the Spirit. Is he doing it here because he understands that, right, or he prays or he hopes or he trusts that his reader will see both the great depth to which symbolism goes, and it goes to a great depth, immense. There's nothing deeper, but also its own ultimate paucity of presence, I guess, maybe. In other words, why these sorts of images? I hope that's not a left turn. Whenever one offers a very compelling figure within the spiritual life, one risks having that become idolatrous. Let's put it that way. And David, you and I were talking about this earlier this week. One of the reasons why I think that Maximus keeps circling around these ideas and saying them in different ways is so that it's hard to memorize them, because he says this similar things again and again. And so we don't have a quotable line, or we don't have a kind of, oh, I'm in fear. Well, Maximus says, do this. Okay, I'll do it. Like you said, Goa, a recipe, or a set of instructions, installment instructions. Pardon me. What do you make of it, Goa? But then others too.
Others.
I don't know what I make of it, Andrew, but it seems that Maximus provides a kind of remedial statement, or a kind of cautionary statement, or maybe an arresting statement of that tendency at the very end in his promise, which was something that I've gotten hung up on as I keep on thinking about it in relation to other parts of the conversation. But when he says it at the very last sentence, for the most exalted of the divine gifts of grace bestowed in this world is scant and minimal compared with those that are held in store for us. It's quite a, I mean, it's a familiar statement, and it can be interpreted, obviously in radically different ways. And this isn't actually how I was thinking about it, but it does, in addition to other things, I suppose, serves to put in perspective any striking image that might inflate your experience, whatever grace comes your way.
I love that last sentence, Mike. I'm so pleased you brought it up, because it is a kind of, it's profoundly moving. It's not flashy though. And sometimes he's not flashy, but sometimes he's striking in his phrasing or something like that. So then maybe another question, and Michael, you and I have talked for hours about this kind of thing. Maybe another kind of question is then, if he's going to go deeply for a time into an image, what does that say about that image? Is he risking anything by going so deeply into this image of days? Or is it one of those images like we have in the Psalms, which are so resplendent and so polyvalent and so rich with life, that there's no way we could ever get trapped into it? There's no way. It's like saying, are you stuck by things, or something general like that? Circumcision doesn't seem to me a symbol that is like that has that depth. Harvest is much closer to that, but still its physical imagery suggests a season and then an end and then a shift. Days is it's a wide open image. And pardon me, maybe these formal questions are not interesting, or maybe they're even nonsensical.
Well, no. I think there is something substantive behind stylistic questions, and I suppose that this is maybe a kind of trite point to make, but there's something about there's a risk with aphorisms that they perform a function of seeding your brain, so that you don't, if you're someone open in a patient way, you don't try to seize on the meaning definitively. But insofar as you're tempted, and now I'm responding to your point, it would be hard with Maximus if as is the case, we have his aphorisms in sequence. There's not just a few that happen to survive, like Heraclitus's aphorisms, and as a result, you do get a sense of the lightness. I don't mean lack of seriousness, but the lightness with the provisional nature of his handling of these issues. And so, when he uses, well, in English, a word like perhaps, and when it would be a pretty muscular interpreter to sort of bracket all of that sense of the person whom you're dealing with, or the way he's put it more impersonally, the way he's handled issues. I mean, this one could be easily tripped up. For example, at the very beginning of this, the first century on theology. Not at the very beginning, but in some of the early passages, he'll make a striking statement, and you'll think, about the nature, for example, of he'll make some striking remark that God is this or that, or God transcends even substantiveness, and then lo and behold, several aphorisms later, he'll make a comment which, if it had been read in isolation, if you had just sort of thrown a dartboard at a list of aphorisms and haven't bothered to read all of them, would have probably been interpreted differently. On that Beautiful, point, yeah. God is the origin, intermediary state, and consummation of all created things. And then he immediately qualifies that. So I think the fact that he does qualify striking statements in the early statements that seem to, kind of set you up for later statements. I think that puts him in sort of safer hermeneutic territory, if you could.
Well, listen, this guy is a monk who is reading the Gospels each and every day, which is full of hyperbole and image and overstatement and and he's clearly a master at handling it. The way he draws these images and makes these connections with Scripture, I mean, Jacob not being caught with the hirsuteness of material things is given the blessing, It's like, wow, this is a virtuoso performance here where he's able to take this. So if he wasn't so drenched in Scripture, but when you realize where he's coming from, the fact that he is playing with the same same images and everything else. I mean, the harvest, Christ talks about the harvest. He tells us about the harvest. So what, I just think this is a type of faithfulness that he is exhibiting.
He is imitating Christ in his manner of depicting.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, since we only have a few minutes left, and I got to say, every Western Protestant reading this, there's going to be that one paragraph where we're told Christ starting his ministry at 30. For those who really understand numbers, this is important.
Yeah.
And for every Western Protestant going, wait a minute, so 5 + 7 + 8 + 10 gets us to 30, so that's why. But it really is something that how rationalistic we Protestants, we're guilty of. That when I read Maximus, and it goes into days and it gets into a lot of other stuff, things that I think of as quantitative, he thinks of as qualitative. And it really is interesting to sort of read through almost 2 millennia later, someone who looks at numbers and sees qualitative things, not just quantitative. And I tell you, that one paragraph was so jarring to me, like, oh, you've got to be kidding. The brilliance and the sheer genius of what I've been reading, and then now he's getting into this, but he's not the one who's at fault, I know. And I just really appreciated it. So I thought I'd put that as a note at the end of the day. Not saying I agree with it, but I appreciate it anyway.
When I read it, I did think of you, David. And I thought, I wonder what Jennings is going to do with this. When you realize that Pythagoreans were hanging around all over the place.
Exactly.
And there were all kinds of other Gnostics with number systems of various sorts. And of course, Judaism as well.
Yeah.
The mystical traditions of Jews have numbers associated with every single letter. And of course, he plays with that with Greek here. So, yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask one serious question with 1 minute left? There was, and Andrew, you raised it at the very beginning, and I thought we might get back to it. In number 7, he said, God being infinitely beyond every kind of relationship. Mm-hmm. And I understand the argument, and I think I follow it and I get it, but how does one speak of the Trinity as being beyond the relationship when the Father, Son, and Spirit are so mutually in service of the other, so enveloped in the other, that I would have thought that separated by itself talking about God, it's not infinitely beyond every kind of relationship, but God actually is what relationship is. I don't know. Anyone else find that odd? And maybe we'll deal with it next time if we're running out of time.
Well, we don't have to, we're not being categorical temporally.
Okay.
But I mean, we want to be observant. But I have a few thin thoughts immediately, and then perhaps Michael, Lorraine, or David, you want to deepen it. Initially, it strikes me as the same thing when he says that like God is being and God is beyond being. To speak apophatically is to speak from from within, through, with,
Right,
and
yeah.
beyond, as we said before. So anything he says about beyond, or God is a relation itself, God is beyond relation, I think it has to be understood that they're balanced in that apophatic spirit. But then he says God is beyond any kind of relationship, which makes me think, so kind, that's what we recognize, right? We recognize a kind of. So he's beyond any kind of relationship. And then he says also he's beyond all categories, I think, of relationship or relation. And I think he categories, that's how we understand that. So it for our human minds, there's no way, I don't think, to understand. I'm with you. There's no possible way to beyond silence, but that silence would be informed already by language, to apprehend the image we've been given of the divinity itself, which is three persons in communion. I mean, that's kind of the word that we have been given in koinonia, in perichoresis, or I like to think of that as like a chorus. It's like an in and through the chorus, weaving in and out of the chorus of voices, but or interpenetration, which is how it's sometimes translated into English. Not well, I don't think. We have to have these metaphors of movement. We have to, because otherwise we can't utter anything. And silence is after utterance, not before utterance. That's the only way I can make sense of it. You know all that stuff already, as well, everyone here does. But that's the only way I can begin to make sense of that. Well, what do you think?
I think for him, the opposite of relationship is presence. That is, relationship is about difference. And so God is beyond relationship. God is simply presence. And the Trinity, I mean, I love those images of the dance and all that sort of thing, but I think the heart of the matter here in this particular piece of the text for him is it's another way of him trying to suggest that we're really talking about something that isn't how we normally think of relationship, where there is difference, there is negotiation, there is,
Right.
it is, so I don't know. I mean,
Yeah,
I think for him in that passage, the opposite of relationship is presence.
I put up one finger the way I did. It just occurred to me when I did this. That's what Muslims often are seen to do when they're prostrate and bowing, and they're making a kind of commentary on the Trinity when they do that. But it's they're obviously missing a certain point, the essential point. But I think David's very eloquent, long disquisition toward the end of our last meeting, and it was quite sublime, and the light was fading at that point, and it made quite an impression. It's actually this is a beautiful thing. It's actually turned upside down a thought that I've had for quite a long time, about a decade, and it's suddenly I'm working on this idea of infinite complexity. But suddenly the idea of simplicity sort of anticipates, and David introduced last week another word for simplicity, or phrase, lack of division. And presence, I suppose, suggests a lack of division, a kind of simplicity. And that really twigged for me, because when we think ontologically, it seems that it's always a kind of very serious compromise if we allow dualities. And even if we allow rigid, I guess this would be a multiplicity, worse than dualities, categories. And so the idea of thinking of relationships categorically in terms of separating, alienating, potentially alienating categories is a fundamental misconception of the divine, and perhaps to just the nature of reality. But we can't help but to do that, when we speak a language. But I have a slightly different view of language than many philosophers of language and linguists. I mean, this is sort of the area that kind of propelled me through graduate school and threw me into silence for about 10 years because I was unhappy with everything I thought about. And it's, you can think about language conventionally and take seriously the semantic conventions through which categories allow us, through syntax, to express ourselves. I think that's a very misguided way of thinking about language, even though for all intents and purposes, we have to rely on categories, on our lexicon, on convention. But language is really ultimately a gift of the logos in whose image we're finitely made, conferred upon us as a kind of as Maximus, I'm just actually quoting him right now, in the early part of this century. Part of that, to be made in that image, is to be made with a capacity for freedom, for agency. And that can be exercised negatively, as David was suggesting last week. And I think that's when we use language in a creaky way, as we must, in the way that I was just disparaging. There's also a way in which we use it in a more affirmative way. And that goes to the heart. Language in that sense is dependent not on conventions and categories, but on this gift of agency. And I'll just throw in one last thing which would seem a little whacked out to anyone outside of a religious tradition. Every time we use agency, and this is picking up a theme from earlier on, I was quite captivated by the discussion for this reason. When we exercise agency, it is really like talking about striking images, the wax melting. It's an act of grace. And no fragment of our agency is made without this synergistic participation, in which we play a smaller role than we think, but it's an important role all the same. Recognizing that that's what's happening when we speak a language, I think transforms the whole equation and allows us to think of languages as suffused in a way, not rather a series of propositional relations that are being constructed.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wax is the gift of the bees. And the queen bee is an ancient image of the holy Theotokos. And that's why John Chrysostom was called Chrysostom.
Oh, so I thought the honeyed tongue was simply because, but it's because he spoke of the Virgin?
Well, it's because everything he said was so
Anointed.
anointed, and sweet, even when he was cruel, which was plenty often. Yeah,
Yeah, there are a couple of sermons directed that straight at me, by the way.
Yeah.
So yeah.
yeah.
Mike, I like what you say about the language that arises from
Yeah.
agency or
Mhm.
created, creative language. I think Bhakti was saying creative language, and how you link that with the gift. And what I'm interested in, not now, but to drop a little coin in your purse for later. I'm very interested in how in what you think of how Maximus deals with silence and utterance then. So if you if you'll indulge me a tiny bit, think about it, because you've thought a lot about this stuff, and we'd love to hear what you have to say.
I have to say, I don't have anything specifically to say about that, but of course,
Not immediately. I
quickly
mean,
what comes to mind is, the person who uses similar in terms of language as similar images, Wittgenstein, but passing over it in silence, and that was crudely, I think, misinterpreted by logical positivists whom he could never really easily meet with. He could meet with them, a few of them, in a private room, but he wasn't really comfortable with, even though he was potentially being, kind of elevated by them. Well, not all of them. And I think he didn't mean by that something, vanquishing, just that there are certain things that can't be talked about in the kind of propositional, rigid way that philosophers in that particular period wanted to talk about seemingly everything. And so he wanted to reserve things like ethics, for example, that couldn't be talked about in that way.
That's one image of utterance ceasing. But another one is Hamlet. And Hamlet is capable of saying anything. And so that's not the same kind of silence then there. And I think your understanding of language, as you were just articulating, is much more along Hamlet's line than along what Wittgenstein was critiquing or fixated on in order to try to break through. That's more the meaning I have. Maximus is kind of like Hamlet, very, very adept with language. And their mother's names are Ophelia, and they, were both written by Shakespeare. So there you go. All right, let's conclude. This is really beautiful.
Everybody wants to play Hamlet.
Thank you all. I'm going to pause the recording right now.